The Atlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history, a period that witnessed unimaginable suffering and inhumanity. It was a period marked by unparalleled cruelty and greed, where human lives were reduced to mere commodities. For centuries, millions of Africans were ripped from their homes and families, torn away from everything they knew and loved. They were forced into a life of servitude in the Americas, enduring back-breaking labor and relentless oppression. This brutal trade left an indelible stain on humanity, the repercussions of which are still felt today, echoing through generations. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just about the buying and selling of human beings. It was a systematic exploitation of an entire continent. It was a complex system of oppression designed to dehumanize and control. This system thrived on the dehumanization of an entire race, stripping away their dignity and humanity. The legacy of this period continues to shape our world, influencing social, economic, and cultural dynamics. It is a history that demands to be remembered, understood, and learned from so that such atrocities are never repeated. The capture of Africans for the slave trade was a brutal affair. European slave traders rarely ventured into the African interior themselves. Instead, they relied on a network of African intermediaries. These intermediaries would capture individuals from neighboring tribes or kingdoms. They would then trade these captives to the Europeans for goods like textiles, guns, and alcohol. This system of trade created and exacerbated conflicts between different African groups. It fostered an atmosphere of mistrust and violence. The promise of wealth and power proved too tempting for some. This led them to betray their own people for profit. The tragic irony is that this trade, designed to exploit Africans, also deeply divided and weakened them. The Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas, was a horrific ordeal. Africans were crammed into the holds of slave ships. They were chained together in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Disease was rampant. The mortality rate on these ships was shockingly high. Those who survived the journey arrived in the Americas traumatized and dehumanized. They had endured weeks, sometimes months, of unimaginable suffering. They were stripped of their names, their identities, and their dignity. The Middle Passage stands as a chilling testament to the depths of human cruelty. The Atlantic slave trade was part of a larger economic system known as the triangular trade. European ships would leave their ports laden with manufactured goods. These goods were traded for enslaved Africans on the African coast. The ships then sailed across the Atlantic to the Americas. In the Americas, the enslaved Africans were sold to work on plantations. These plantations produced crops like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. These raw materials were then shipped back to Europe, where they were processed and sold for immense profits. This cycle of trade enriched European nations and fueled their economies. It did so at the horrific cost of millions of African lives. Section 5: Millions enslaved, countless lost. The exact number of Africans enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade is unknown. However, historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. This number represents only those who survived the journey. Countless others died during capture, imprisonment, or the Middle Passage itself. The impact of this massive, forced migration on Africa was devastating. It resulted in the loss of generations of its people. Those who were taken were often the strongest and healthiest members of their communities. This further weakened the social and economic fabric of African societies. Section 6: Shattered societies, enduring wounds. The transatlantic slave trade had a profound and lasting impact on African societies. The loss of so many people, particularly young men and women, led to significant population decline in many regions. It also disrupted traditional social structures and economic activities. Furthermore, the introduction of European firearms into Africa fueled conflicts and instability. This intensified existing rivalries and led to the rise of powerful warlords who profited from the slave trade. The legacy of this instability continues to cast a shadow over parts of Africa today. Section 7. A Light in the Darkness, the Abolition Movement. As the horrors of the slave trade became more widely known, the world began to awaken to the brutal reality. A movement to abolish it gained momentum, fueled by the voices of those who could no longer stay silent. Abolitionists, driven by moral outrage and a deep sense of injustice, emerged as beacons of hope. They campaigned tirelessly to end this barbaric practice, often facing great personal risk. They published pamphlets and books, organized protests, and spread their message far and wide. They lobbied governments to outlaw the trade, appealing to the conscience of lawmakers. Their efforts eventually led to the abolition of the slave trade in Britain in 1807, a monumental victory. And in the United States in 1808, however, the journey was far from over. The fight for emancipation continued for decades, with many battles still to be fought. It wasn't until the end of the American Civil War in 1865, under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln, that slavery was finally abolished in the United States, marking a new dawn of freedom and hope. Section 8. Legacy of a Dark Past, Lessons for the Future. The transatlantic slave trade remains a dark stain on human history, a period marked by unimaginable suffering and inhumanity. It is a stark reminder of the capacity for cruelty and greed that exists within humanity, a testament to the depths of human depravity. Yet, it is also a story of resilience, resistance, and the enduring power of the human spirit as countless individuals fought for their freedom and dignity. The legacy of the slave trade continues to shape our world today, influencing our social, economic, and political landscapes. It is evident in the systemic racism and inequality that persist in many societies, manifesting in various forms of discrimination and injustice. It is imperative that we remember this dark chapter in our past to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. Not only to honor the memory of those who suffered, but also to acknowledge their strength and courage. But also to learn from our mistakes, to educate future generations about the horrors of slavery, and to build a more just and equitable future for all, where every individual is valued and respected regardless of their background.